The night Claire Harmon stood up at her family's dinner table and looked her father directly in the eye, the entire room went quiet. Not the polite kind of quiet, the held breath kind, where you can hear the candle flames. I was standing near the back of the room in my work jacket, still dusty from 4 hours of driving. I had almost not come. I had sat in the parking lot of that estate for 6 full minutes, telling myself I had no business walking through those doors. Her father had his glass halfway to his mouth. Her mother's hands were folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Preston Whitfield III sat beside Claire in a pressed linen shirt, the kind of man who had never once been told no and had the expression to prove it. And Claire, she wasn't looking at any of them. She was looking at me. She said 4 words, quiet enough that only the people nearest to her should have been able to hear. But the room was that still. Everyone heard. He's who I choose. I had been holding my breath since I walked through those doors. I let it go. Her father set his glass down very carefully, and everything I thought I knew about where my life was headed changed in an instant. But I need to take you back. None of that moment makes sense without what came before it. And what came before it started on a Tuesday morning in early April, with a wrong turn down a gravel road and a woman standing on a porch who looked at me like I was the last person she expected to see. My name is Ryan Calloway. I'm 30 years old. I live in a town called Barlow Falls in upstate New York, and I build things for a living. Not in any glamorous way. I take old things apart and put them back together better than they were. Cabinets, staircases, flooring that hasn't been touched in 40 years. I learned everything I know from a man named Frank Gruber, who hired me at 17 when I had nothing and taught me that if you're going to do a thing, you do it right or you don't do it at all. Frank passed away 3 years ago and left me his tools and his client list. I've been trying to honor both ever since. The Harmon job came through a referral. Douglas Harmon owned a real estate company in Manhattan, which I didn't know until after I agreed to the work. His property manager called and said they had a lake house near Barlow Falls that needed significant renovation. Floors, kitchen cabinets, the back deck. The family used it only in summers, but they wanted it ready by June. Standard job. I drove out that Tuesday to take measurements and make a materials list. What I didn't know was that the house wasn't empty. I pulled my truck down the long gravel driveway and parked behind a dark green car I didn't recognize. The lake house was old money beautiful. Weathered cedar shingles, wide windows, a porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the house like an embrace. It sat back from the water about 30 yards, and on a morning in April when the light comes sideways through the trees, the whole thing looked like something out of a painting. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to. Then the front door opened. She was wearing an oversized sweater and carrying a coffee mug. And she stopped when she saw me the same way I stopped when I saw her. Not a romantic freeze. More like 2 people who each expected to be alone and suddenly weren't. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was careful. Not rude, but not warm. I held up my folder. "Ryan Calloway. I'm the contractor. Someone should have left you a note." No one left me anything. She looked at the folder, then at me. "My mother hired someone?" "Your family's property manager hired me. I was told the house would be empty." She looked past me at the driveway, then back at the house, then at me again. Whatever she was thinking moved across her face quickly and then disappeared behind something more composed. "When do you need to start?" "Today, if that's all right. Just measurements. I won't be in your way." She stepped back from the doorway and held it open. "Fine. But I work in the mornings. Don't talk to me until afternoon." That was how I met Claire Harmon. I spent the first morning doing exactly what I said I would. Measurements, notes, nothing more. She sat at the kitchen table with a laptop and a second cup of coffee and did not look at me once. I learned later that she was a landscape architect, that she'd been in the middle of a project when she came to the lake house, and that she'd been here for 2 weeks before I arrived. I didn't learn any of that on day 1. On day 1, I kept my head down and my mouth shut and left just after 1 in the afternoon without saying goodbye. I came back Wednesday with materials for the back deck. She was on the porch when I pulled in, standing with her arms crossed, looking at the water. She didn't hear me come up the steps until I was almost beside her. She startled. "Sorry," I said. "I should have made more noise." She looked at me for a second. "You always walk that quietly?" "Habit. Frank used to say a good carpenter doesn't disturb the house." "Who's Frank?" "The man who taught me." She turned back to the water. I set my toolbox down and started examining the deck boards. 3 of them were cracked through and 2 more were soft with rot. It would need more work than the property manager had described. "What's the verdict?" she asked without looking at me. "It's worse than I was told. Probably 4 or 5 days out here alone, depending on the weather." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't complain about surprises. Complaining doesn't fix the boards." She looked at me then. Not a long look, just a glance, quickly away, but there was something in it. The beginning of curiosity, maybe. Or the recognition of something familiar. "I'll stay out of your way," she said, and went back inside. By the end of that first week, we had fallen into something like a schedule. She worked mornings. I worked through the whole day, but quietly when she was inside. Around noon, she'd come out with 2 mugs of coffee without asking if I wanted one, and set mine on the railing without comment. I'd take it without thanks, and for a few minutes we'd both stand there looking at the lake. She didn't talk much. I appreciated that. Most clients fill every silence with nervous words about the house, as if they need to perform their ownership for me. Claire didn't perform anything. She just existed in the space with an ease that I found myself looking forward to, though I wouldn't have admitted it yet. On the 5th day, I was replacing the final deck board when a piece of the subflooring came apart, and I put my hand through to the elbow. Nothing broken, just a gash across my forearm from a rusted nail. I sat back and looked at it the way you do when you're deciding whether it's bad enough to stop working. Claire came around the corner of the house at that exact moment. "You're bleeding," she said. "Little bit." She disappeared inside and came back with a first aid kit that was better stocked than anything I kept in my truck. She sat down on the deck beside me without asking, opened the kit, and cleaned the wound with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before. "You're good at this," I said. "I grew up on job sites. My father renovated 3 houses when I was a kid. I was always the one following the workers around." She pressed a bandage down and smoothed the edges carefully. "He never understood why I liked it more than the finished houses." "What do you mean?" "The before is more interesting than the after, when everything's torn apart and you can see what it's made of." She looked at the exposed subfloor, then at me. "Most people only want the finished version." I didn't answer right away. I was thinking about the way she said it, like she wasn't only talking about houses. "You do landscape architecture," I said. "That's all before and after." She smiled for the first time. Not a full smile, just the corner of her mouth. "Most of my clients only want the after too." That was the first real conversation we had, and something about it changed the temperature of the whole job. The kitchen took 2 weeks. I won't bore you with the details of the work itself, but I will tell you that somewhere in those 2 weeks, the coffee on the railing turned into lunch at the kitchen table, and the not talking turned into long conversations about nothing important and then about things that mattered. She told me about growing up as the only daughter of a man who measured everything in value. Not in a bitter way, she said it flatly like she was describing the weather. Douglas Harmon had built his real estate company from a small agency into something worth several $100 million, and he had done it by being the kind of man who never paid more for something than he believed it was worth. That included people. "He's not cruel," she said one afternoon, watching me sand a cabinet door with my back to her. "He just has a very clear ledger in his head. Everyone has a column. Where do you fall in the ledger?" She was quiet for a moment. "I used to be in the asset column. Then I broke off my engagement and apparently I moved. I stopped sanding." "How long ago?" 4 months. She picked at the edge of the kitchen table. "His name was Preston. Preston Whitfield III, which is the kind of name that tells you everything you need to know." I turned around. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her hands. "My father introduced us. Preston's family has connections my father had been trying to build for 20 years. The merger made sense on paper. We made sense on paper. She looked up. I kept waiting to feel something that wasn't paper. I didn't ask what she meant. I thought I understood. And your father didn't take the broken engagement well, I said. He took it like a business loss. She stood up and refilled her coffee. He's been waiting for me to come to my senses ever since. I turned back to the cabinet, and for a long time after that, neither of us said anything. But the silence was different now. It had weight to it. That was the beginning of understanding her. And understanding her, I realized slowly, was the thing I had most looked forward to each morning when I drove down that gravel road. By the middle of the third week, I was staying later than the job required. Not obviously, I always had a reason. A section of flooring that needed an extra coat. A cabinet hinge that was slightly off. The kind of small corrections that you only make because you care about the work. But the truth, which I was not ready to look at directly yet, was that I was finding reasons to stay because leaving felt like the wrong direction. She started cooking dinner on Thursdays. Just simple things. Pasta, soup, bread from a bakery in town. She never asked if I wanted to stay. She just set a second plate. The first time it happened, I almost said I should be heading back. Then I looked at the light coming through the kitchen window and the steam rising from the bowl she'd placed across from hers, and I sat down. If you've ever had a meal with someone where the conversation never once felt like work, where you could say the half-formed things and they understood what you meant before you finished, then you know how rare it is. Those Thursday dinners were like that. We talked about her graduate thesis on native plant restoration. I told her about a farmhouse I'd rebuilt 2 years ago that had hand-carved details in the staircase I'd spent 3 days trying to replicate exactly. She asked to see photos. I showed her. She asked questions no one had ever asked me about the work before. Do you ever feel like you're in conversation with the people who built it originally? She asked, scrolling through my photos. Every time, I said, and I meant it. She looked up at me. The kitchen light was warm and low, and something in her expression had softened past the careful composure she usually kept in place. For exactly 1 second, neither of us looked away. Then she handed my phone back and said she needed to check on the pasta, and the moment slipped past us like water. I drove home that night telling myself the obvious things. She was a client. She was from a world I didn't belong in. She was coming off a broken engagement and she was here alone, and people in that position reach for the nearest warm thing. I told myself all of it. And then I went to sleep and dreamed about the way she'd looked up from my phone, and I woke up knowing none of the obvious things were going to be enough. The 4th week, her mother called while I was working on the master bedroom floor. I could hear Claire's voice through the wall, not the words, just the tone, which shifted from relaxed to careful in the way it always did when she was managing someone's expectations. When she came back to check on my progress, she was quieter than usual. "Everything okay?" I asked. "My parents are coming up this weekend. My father wants to see the renovation." I kept my eyes on the floor. "I can work around them, or take the weekend off if that's easier." "It's not," she stopped. "It'll just be different." It was different. Douglas Harmon arrived Saturday morning in a car that cost more than I made in 3 years. He was tall, silver-haired, and had the handshake of a man who used it to establish things. He shook my hand and then looked past me at the kitchen cabinets. "These are the shaker fronts. I expected a cleaner line." "It's consistent with the original style of the house," I said. "I can show you the reference photos if you'd like." He looked at me the way you might look at a word you almost recognized but couldn't quite place. "You're local?" "Barlow Falls, born here." He nodded once, like he'd filed the information somewhere he didn't expect to need it. Margaret Harmon was warmer. She looked at the kitchen and said it was beautiful, and she meant it. But she spent most of the weekend watching Claire in a way that reminded me of someone reading a document for something they'd missed the first time. The Saturday evening, I stayed later than I should have. I was finishing a section of floor near the back door and lost track of time. When I came through the kitchen to let myself out, Douglas and Margaret were on the front porch and Claire was washing dishes. She heard me and turned. "Still here," she said. "Not an accusation, an observation. Lost track. I'll get out of your way." She shook her head. You're not in my way. She turned back to the dishes. They think something's going on between us. I stopped. I know. She turned around and looked at me directly. Is there? The kitchen was very quiet. Outside I could hear her parents talking on the porch, low voices, the sound of the lake beyond them. I said, that depends on you. She held my gaze for a long moment. I don't know what I'm ready for. That's a fair answer. I'm not trying to, Claire. I said it quietly. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just answering your question honestly. She looked down at the dish towel in her hands. Then she looked back up. Okay, she said, and I didn't know exactly what she meant by it, but I believed there was something in it. I let myself out through the back door. Her parents left Sunday afternoon. By Monday morning, something had settled between Claire and me that hadn't been there before. I don't know how to describe it exactly except to say that the air in the rooms felt different, more intentional. She brought coffee earlier. I worked closer to wherever she was in the house. We talked more, and the conversations went longer without either of us reaching for a reason to end them. On Wednesday of that week, we drove into town together because I needed a specific kind of finish for the floors and I'd miscalculated how much I had. She came without a particular reason. We walked through the hardware store and she picked up things she didn't need and asked me about each of them with the focused curiosity she brought to everything she was genuinely interested in. In the parking lot afterward, we got sandwiches from a place I'd been going to since I was a teenager and sat on the tailgate of my truck. She said, "Tell me about Frank." And I did. I told her how he found me at 17, fresh out of a difficult situation at home, no plan and no prospects. How he handed me a broom and said, "Clean the shop and he'd think about the rest." How I swept that shop for a week before he handed me a level and told me to start paying attention. How he taught me that wood has memory, that the grain tells you how it wants to move if you take the time to listen. How he used to say that the best thing you could build was something that would outlast you. I told her he died in his workshop, which was the way he would have wanted it. Claire was quiet for a while after that. Then she said, "I think about that sometimes, what I want to outlast me. What do you come up with?" She looked at the trees at the end of the parking lot, and I watched her face while she thought. "Something living," she said finally. "A garden somewhere that keeps growing after I'm gone. Something that doesn't need me to hold it together." I thought about that the whole drive back to the house. That night, on the porch after dinner, the sky was clear enough that you could see the band of the Milky Way above the lake. We sat close enough that our shoulders touched. At some point, she turned her head and I turned mine, and she kissed me so softly I wasn't completely sure it had happened until she pulled back and looked at me. "I've been thinking about doing that for 2 weeks," she said. "I've been thinking about it longer than that." She laughed, quietly, a little surprised. And then she kissed me again, not softly this time. And the lake reflected the stars and the porch boards were solid beneath us, and I thought, quietly, that this was the kind of moment Frank had always said a man should recognize when it came to him. And I was recognizing it, and it terrified me. I should have known it wouldn't stay that simple. Her father called the following Friday. I know because she went very still in the middle of explaining something about a planting design she was working on and said, "I have to take this." She walked down toward the water and I watched her shoulders rise and then slowly set into the shape I'd come to recognize as her getting ready to hold something up. She was on the phone for 40 minutes. When she came back, she didn't say much. We ate dinner in a different kind of silence that night. Not comfortable but not hostile either. Just heavy with something she hadn't opened yet. The next morning, she told me, her father was hosting a family dinner the following weekend at his estate in Connecticut. It was framed as an end-of-renovation celebration. He'd seen the progress photos she'd been sending and wanted to acknowledge the work. But she'd heard from her mother separately that Preston would be there. "He wants to try again," she said, looking into her coffee. "My father arranged it." I kept my voice even. "What do you want?" She looked up at me. "I'm here, aren't I?" "That doesn't answer the question." She set her mug down. "I don't want Preston. I haven't wanted Preston since about 6 months into our engagement. I stayed because I kept thinking the feeling would come." She paused. "It never came. Does your father know about us?" She was quiet for a moment. He knows something changed. He hasn't asked directly. I turned back to the cabinet I was finishing. You should go to the dinner. Ryan, he's your father. And whatever this is between us, it's 3 weeks old. You don't owe me the kind of loyalty that costs you your family. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I started to wonder if I'd misread everything, if I'd been a comfortable thing during a difficult time and nothing more. What if I want to give it that kind of loyalty, she said. I turned around. She was looking at me with the directness she brought to everything she was serious about. Then earn it first, I said. Don't protect it before it's strong enough to stand on its own. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly, like she understood something she hadn't expected to agree with. I went back to the cabinet, and I tried not to think about the Connecticut dinner. If you've ever cared about someone and told them to do the thing that might take them away from you, you know how that week felt. I worked through every room in that house with a focus that had more to do with keeping my head occupied than with the work itself. She was quieter than usual, too. We moved around each other carefully, like two people who had said too much and not enough at the same time, and neither of us knew how to close the distance. The last night before she was supposed to drive down to Connecticut, I finished the last of the floors. We stood in the kitchen together, looking at the completed space. The house was done. Clean lines, warm wood, the light moving across the surfaces the way it's supposed to when everything is right. It's beautiful, she said. Frank would have fixed the one cabinet hinge that's slightly off. She laughed. Of course he would. We stood there for a while. Then I picked up my toolbox. I'll leave my contact information with the property manager if anything needs adjusting in the first few months. She looked at me sharply. That's how you're leaving? What do you want me to say, Claire? I want you to say something that sounds like you're not already half gone. I set the toolbox down. I'm not half gone. I'm completely here. I've been here since the first Thursday when you put a plate across from yours without asking. I stepped closer. But I'm also a carpenter from a town you've been visiting for 6 weeks, and tomorrow you're walking into a room full of people who have known you your whole life. I don't want to be the voice in your head that confuses that. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and put her hand flat against my chest, over my heart. You've been in my head since the first morning, she said. That's not confusion. I covered her hand with mine. Come back, I said. After the dinner. Whatever happens, come back here. She looked up at me. And then we figure it out. She held my gaze and didn't look away. Okay, she said, and this time I knew exactly what she meant. I drove home that night with the windows down and the smell of lake water following me down the highway, and I realized I didn't know what I was preparing myself for. She called me Saturday afternoon. I was in my workshop, not working, just sitting with my hands around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. He invited Preston to dinner early, she said. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the tightness underneath. They've been talking for an hour. I don't know what he said to Preston, but Preston looks like a man who's been promised something. Are you okay? I'm fine, she stopped. Ryan, come. I looked at the cold coffee. 4 hours to Connecticut. I hadn't been invited. I had no reason to walk into that house except the 4 words she'd just said. Give me the address, I said. I changed out of my work clothes and into the cleanest thing I owned. Dark jeans, a button-down shirt, the work jacket. I looked in the mirror once and decided it was enough. I got in the truck and drove. If you've ever driven toward something you weren't sure you had the right to want, you know what those 4 hours felt like. I went over every version of what might happen. Her father's face when he saw me. Preston's polished certainty. Claire in the middle of all of it, having to make a decision in front of everyone who had an opinion about her choices. I almost turned around twice. Each time, I thought about her hand flat against my chest, and I kept driving. The Harmon estate was the kind of house that was built to make you feel small before you even reached the door. I parked on the far side of the gravel drive, out of the main line of sight, and sat there for 6 minutes. Then I got out of the truck. I heard the dinner before I saw it. Light, through tall windows, voices, the clink of glasses. I was let in by a housekeeper who seemed uncertain what to do with me but didn't stop me. I found the dining room and stood near the back of it, close to the door, and I saw Claire before she saw me. She was sitting beside Preston, who had his hand resting on the back of her chair, not touching her but close. Her parents were at the head of the table. Her father was in the middle of a toast, glass raised, smile in place. He was talking about the family's future, about partnerships built on shared values, about knowing where you belong. I watched Claire's face while he spoke. She was looking at the tablecloth, and then she looked up, and she found me. Something shifted in her face, relief, or resolution, or both. She pushed her chair back slowly, the way you do when you've made a decision and you're moving before you can unmake it. Preston noticed. Douglas noticed. The table went quiet. "Claire," her father said. Steady, warning. She stood up fully. She looked at her father. "I have something to say." "This isn't the moment." "It is," she said. "It's exactly the moment." Preston reached for her arm. "Sit down, we can talk privately." She looked at his hand on her arm. Then she looked at him. "I've been very clear with you for a year. Every private conversation has ended the same way." She stepped back so his hand dropped away. "I'm saying it publicly now, so there's no version of this where I wasn't clear." The room was completely still. I was not breathing. She turned her head, and she looked at me, and she said it. "He's who I choose." Douglas Harmon set his glass down so carefully it made almost no sound. He looked at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. The same assessment he'd used on my cabinet work, looking for value, looking for where something fit. "You're the carpenter," he said. "I am. You drove 4 hours to stand in the back of my dining room. I drove 4 hours because your daughter called me." He looked at Claire. Something moved through his expression, anger first, then something more complicated that he put away quickly. Preston stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked out without speaking to anyone. A few of the other guests shifted in their chairs. No one seemed sure where to look. Margaret Harmon broke the silence. She looked at her daughter and said, very quietly, "You look like yourself right now." Claire exhaled. And for the first time since I'd walked through that door, I felt the room come back to its normal size. Douglas Harmon and I did not become friends that night. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where the father shakes the carpenter's hand and says, "You're good enough for my daughter," and everyone goes home happy. What happened was quieter and more real than that. After Preston left and the remaining guests found reasons to leave shortly after, I stood in the kitchen with a glass of water while Claire spoke with her parents in the next room. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. I heard the shape of it without hearing the words. Long silences. Her father's voice rising and then settling. Her mother speaking at length toward the end. When Claire came back into the kitchen, she looked tired and lighter at the same time. "The way you look after you've set something heavy down." "How bad?" I asked. He said I was throwing away my future for a feeling. "What did you say?" I said a future without a feeling wasn't worth much. She picked up my glass and took a sip of my water without asking. He said I'd feel differently when the feeling faded. "What did you say to that?" She set the glass down and looked at me. I said I'd let him know. I smiled. I couldn't help it. And she smiled back, tired but real. And I thought, that's enough. That right there is enough. We drove back to the lake house that night. Not because there was any work left to do, just because it was the place where we'd figured out the thing between us, and it felt right to go back to it. We sat on the repaired deck in the dark with the lake quiet below us and the sky doing what it does in April when the weather is clear. She said, "My father is going to be difficult for a while. I know, he might never fully approve. I know that too. Does that bother you?" I thought about it honestly. It would bother me more to have the wrong version of this than the right version without his approval. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. The boards beneath us were solid. I knew they were because I had replaced every last one of them, and I had done it right. That was 8 months ago. The lake house is fully done, and Claire's firm has been commissioned to redesign the grounds around it, which means she spends more time in Barlow Falls than in the city. She's been slowly converting the back section of my workshop into a studio space for the landscape models she builds by hand. I told her she didn't need my permission. She said she knew, but she wanted mine anyway. Douglas Harmon came up once in September. He stood on the new deck and looked at the lake and then looked at the floors I'd laid through the kitchen and the back hallway. He said they were well done. He didn't say much else. But as he was leaving, he stopped at the door and looked at me with that same measuring expression. "She's stubborn like her mother," he said. I know. Her mother was right more often than I admitted at the time. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he walked out to his car. It wasn't a blessing, but it wasn't the opposite either. I stood there thinking about what Frank used to say, that you build what you can with the materials available. You don't wait for perfect conditions. You work with what you have, and you work with care, and you let the thing become what it was meant to be. 2 weeks ago, Claire was sitting at the kitchen table drawing a planting plan for a project in Vermont, and I was replacing a drawer pull that had come loose, and the afternoon light was doing what it does in November when it comes low through the windows and turns everything gold. She looked up from her work and caught me watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "You're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you look like you're filing something away." I laughed. She was right. I was. Because I knew even then that I would want to remember this. The low light, the drawer pull in my hand, the sound of her pencil on paper, the way the repaired house settled around us like it had decided we were what it had been waiting for. Sometimes a thing doesn't need to be dramatic to matter. Sometimes a life changes not with a crash but with a Tuesday morning and a wrong turn and a woman on a porch who says don't talk to me until afternoon, and you spend the rest of your time finding out what she means after that. Frank used to say the best thing you could build was something that would outlast you. I think I finally understand what he meant.